The autumn rain came sideways across Harrow Creek, Colorado territory, the kind that found every gap in a coat and did not apologize for it. Clara Moss stood on the steps of First Methodist Church with her carpet bag at her feet and the water running in cold lines down the back of her neck. She had been standing there long enough that the lamplight behind the windows had changed color, going from the warm gold of the evening service to something harder and more deliberate, and the door had been pulled shut by the hand of Elder Silas Horne with a sound that carried the weight of a verdict. She had not raised her voice. She had said her name and where she had come from, and that she was a widow 3 months out of Lancaster, Ohio, with no money for the hotel and no letters of character because the river crossing 2 days east of town had taken them, along with the tin box she had packed them in. She was asking for one night out of the rain. Horne had looked her over the way a man looked at something he had found on his doorstep that he did not send for, and told her the church shelter was not for women traveling without references or male escort. There were standards to maintain. She was welcome to attend the Sunday service in the morning. Then he had closed the door on her face. If this story is touching your heart, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if a woman in your family came west with nothing and built a home, share her name in the comments. I read every one. Clara picked up her bag. She did not allow herself 10 seconds of standing there, because a woman who stood weeping on church steps in a strange town gave the town something to talk about for years, and she had no interest in becoming other people's story. She stepped down into the mud and pulled her coat collar up and walked. She tried the hotel first. The Catwoman's Rest sat on the main street with a lantern burning above the door, and the man at the desk looked at her carpet bag and her wet hair and told her the cheapest room was $2 a night, which was more than she had. She thanked him and turned back out into the rain. She tried the boarding house on the south side of the street where a woman named Mrs. Greer answered the door with a lamp in one hand and a look on her face that had already decided. Mrs. Greer told her there was no room. She said it with her chin lifted, and the look she gave Clara's muddy hem made plain that the room itself was not the issue. The livery stable man turned her away with impatience and not much else. The general store was the most painful because the storekeeper, a Mr. Pell, had the decency to look genuinely uncomfortable before he told her there was nothing he could do and suggested she try the church. She told him she had. He shook his head and went back to his ledger, and she saw his hand hesitate over the page for a moment before it settled, and she thought he was a man who would think about this later, when it was too late to matter. She got 6 doors in before she stopped counting. The rain had the particular coldness of a Colorado autumn night. Working its way under the collar and through the warm places in the coat she had bought secondhand in Kansas, and the mud of Harrow Creek's Main Street pulled at her boots with every step. She was hungry and tired in the deep way that came from days of travel with nothing to look forward to at the end of it, and she stood under the narrow awning of the general store and made herself think clearly. Her father had always said that the only thing that got a person through a bad situation was refusing to look at all of it at once. You looked at the next step, just the next one. She had 6 doors left in her count. She would try them all. Clara Moss had come west for reasons that made sense in June, when Thomas was still alive. Thomas had been a steady man and a good one, not given to talking, and he had died of typhoid fever in the 3rd week of June with a speed that left no time to make arrangements. He had been sick on a Tuesday and dead by Sunday morning, and everything she had built inside the frame of his name turned out to have been built on his wage and his standing, neither of which survived him. His family was not cruel about it. They were simply clear. The house was Thomas's. The farm was Thomas's. The plan he had made to go west was Thomas's plan. She had 3 weeks to decide what she would do. She took the money she had saved across 10 years of putting away $1 here and $2 there from the household accounts, packed the carpet bag Thomas had bought for their trip west, and got on the train. She was 28 years old, and she had nowhere to be and no one waiting for her. And she thought that the West was at least a place where the lack of those things was common enough not to be notable. There were women who had come west with nothing before her, and some of them had built something from it, and she intended to be one of those women. She did not know exactly what she was building toward, but she knew what she was good for, and she thought that had to be enough to start with. What she carried that no one could see was everything her father had spent 20 years pressing into her hands. Dr. Amos Marsh of Lancaster, Ohio, had been a frontier-trained physician in the old style, which meant he worked with what he had, plants and patience, and the particular knowledge that came from riding out to farms in all weather to sit beside people when the nearest hospital was 2 days away. He had no sons, and his wife had died when Clara was 4. And so Clara became his apprentice whether she had intended it or not, following him on his round from the time she was 8 years old, holding the lamp, mixing the poultices, learning to read a fever the way other girls learned to read music. By the time she was 20, she could identify the sound of fluid collecting in a chest. She knew which barks brought a temperature down and which roots reduced swelling and joints stiffened with winter. She had spent the last decade nursing Thomas's mother through her winters and the neighbor children through their croup and colds and one winter of scarlet fever that came through the whole street. But you could not walk into a strange town and announce that you could heal people. You needed papers. You needed a man to confirm what you said you were, and all of Clara's papers were at the bottom of a river near Bensford, and Thomas was dead, and the church had closed its door. She was still standing under the general store awning when she heard Elder Horne's voice across the street. He had come out of the church and was standing under the eaves with 2 women from his congregation, Mrs. Aldrich and her daughter-in-law, both of them in good wool coats with their hoods pulled up. Their voices carried the way voices carried in cold air, clear and unhurried, and Horne was saying that this was exactly the kind of situation that required careful discernment. A woman traveling alone, without papers or escort, was a woman whose account of herself did not hold together, and the congregation had a duty to protect itself from those who would take advantage of Christian charity. Mrs. Aldrich said something Clara could not make out. Horne said that a woman of genuine good character would have made better arrangements before presenting herself at a stranger's door. Clara went back to counting doors. She tried the millinery, where the woman inside shook her head through the glass without opening it. She tried the doctor's office, where a note said Dr. Edgar Pratt was away at the Calloway ranch on a medical call and would return in the morning. She stood at the door of a small seamstress's shop for a full minute before she knocked and got no answer. She tried the back door of the hotel kitchen on the thought that they might have space for a worker, but the cook there sent her away with a shake of her head and something that might have been an apology buried in the gesture. She was back in the middle of the street when she became aware that someone had come to stand beside her. The man was somewhere in his early 40s, tall, with the kind of frame that came from years of work done outside and not much rest. His coat was dark with rain along the shoulders, and he wore it the way men wore coats when they had stopped thinking about them long ago. He was still in the way men were still when they had learned not to waste their movements, and he had clearly been standing in the doorway of the feed store across the street long enough to have watched most of what had happened. He looked at her carpet bag and her mud-caked boots and the wet hem of her coat. He said, "You're looking for a place to stay." "I'm looking for work," Clara said, "in exchange for a room and meals. I'm a widow. I have nursing skills and a working knowledge of medicinal plants and fever management. My references were lost in a river crossing. I know that makes my account worth very little in a strange town." He nodded slowly. From across the street, Horne's voice cut through the rain. "Eli," he said it the way a man said a word he believed ought to carry authority. The man beside Clara turned his head toward Horne with a look that communicated a very great deal without moving his face much at all. He said, "I appreciate it, Silas," and turned back to Clara as if the exchange had not happened. "My name is Eli Calloway," he said. "I run a spread 4 miles north of town. My son has had a fever for 3 days, and Dr. Pratt hasn't broken it. My daughter is 10 years old, and she's been keeping the house together by herself. I need someone capable who can manage a sick child and a household." He paused. "You said fever management. My father was a physician. He trained me beside him for 20 years. I know fevers. I know what breaks them and what is not." Eli looked at her for a moment longer. "I can offer a room of your own, 3 meals a day, and fair wages on Fridays. You'd earn your keep. This is not charity." Clara said, "I don't want charity. I want work." He picked up her bag before she could reach for it, which surprised her, and started toward the hitching rail where a wagon and a horse stood waiting in the rain. She followed him. She heard Horne call Eli's name once more behind them, sharper this time. Eli did not look back. The wagon road, north, ran along the edge of a creek that was already running high, the sound of it steady and close through the dark and the rain. Eli drove without talking much, and Clara watched the country go by, the scrub oak and the pine and the wet stone catching the faint light, thinking about what kind of fever kept a child down for 3 days without breaking. 3 days meant the body had been working against something that would not let go, and 3 days without a break also meant the child was strong enough to still be fighting, which was the thing to hold on to. The night smelled of pine resin and wet earth and the cold particular to high country, and the horses moved at an easy, steady pace, as if they knew the road well enough to walk it in the dark. Eli broke the silence about 2 miles out. He said his wife had been named May, and she had died in February, 13 months ago, of a fever that started as something ordinary and became something it should not have been. He said this without preamble, as a fact he wanted her to have before they arrived. Clara understood why. A man who had watched his wife die of a fever had a certain relationship to his son's fever that she should not mistake for simple worry, and he wanted her to understand what she was walking into. She said she was sorry about May. He said thank you and went back to the road. The Calloway ranch was larger than she had expected from a man who drove his own wagon to town in a rainstorm. A good stone house with a wide front porch, several solid outbuildings, a barn with a lamp burning in it where someone was still working late. The kitchen window glowed warm and amber against the wet dark, and it was the first warm thing Clara had seen in hours. A girl opened the door before the wagon had properly stopped. She was 10 years old and had her father's stillness about her, wearing it the way children wore adult expressions when they had to grow into them faster than expected. Ruth Calloway stood in the doorway with a dish towel over her shoulder and looked at Clara with the measured wariness of a child who had been managing adults for a year and did not trust new ones easily. She had set the table, Clara could see behind her, and the kitchen was in good order. She had been waiting. "This is Mrs. Moss," Eli said. "She's going to help with Daniel." Ruth stepped back to let them in without saying anything, which was its own kind of response. The house was clean in the way a house was clean when someone had been working very hard to keep it so. The floor had been swept recently. The dishes were done. A pot of beans sat on the back of the stove, giving off a good smell that reached the door. Clara took in a hold of it and felt a weight of respect for Ruth Calloway settle on her before she had said a word to the girl. This child had been holding this household together alone, and she had done it well. She said, "Can I see him?" Ruth looked at her father. He nodded once. Ruth led Clara down a short hallway to a narrow room where a boy lay in a bed with a quilt pulled to his chin. He was 7 years old and small for it, with dark circles under his eyes and the high flush of a fever that had been building. His breathing was shallow but regular. Clara put her wrist to his forehead and felt what she had expected. High, not catastrophic yet, but it needed careful work through the night. She pulled the quilt back and checked his neck and his chest. She lifted his wrist and held it, counting. She looked up at Eli, who was in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and his face was doing something he was working hard to control. "I need willow bark and elderflower and cool water and clean cloths. If you don't have the bark, the apothecary in town will have it. Can you ride for it tonight?" "I can go now," Eli said. "Before you go, tell me what Dr. Pratt tried." Eli told her. Pratt had given quinine, which was correct, and had recommended cold compresses, which were right in principle. But Ruth had been managing them alone, and the intervals had grown too long in the spaces between her attention, and the fever had been allowed to build each time the compresses warmed and were not replaced quickly enough. "It's a matter of keeping it from spiking," Clara said. "His body can do the work if we hold the temperature steady. Go for the bark. I'll start the compresses now." She was already rolling up her sleeves. Ruth watched from the doorway while Clara worked. Clara did not try to explain herself or make conversation. She wetted the cloth, wrung it carefully, laid it across Daniel's forehead, checked his temperature at his wrist and his neck, replaced the cloth when it warmed. She did this in a steady rotation for 40 minutes before Eli returned with the willow bark, which he had roused the apothecary from bed to obtain, and paid him without a word about the hour. Clara made the tea in the kitchen, letting Ruth stand at her elbow and watch the way she measured and steeped. She said, "The bark lowers a fever by cooling the blood slightly from within. The elderflower opens the pores so the heat can work its way out through the skin. Together, they give the fever something to work against besides the child's own strength." Ruth said, "Dr. Pratt didn't do that." "Dr. Pratt didn't do wrong," Clara said. "He didn't have the bark ready, and he didn't have someone to watch through the night. Two different roads to the same destination." She brought the tea to Daniel and worked 2 careful sips into him before he turned his head away. She went back to the compresses and kept at them, changing them before they fully warmed, keeping the intervals short. Ruth, after a while, pulled a chair to the other side of the bed and took over the work at Daniel's feet without being asked, keeping them cool while Clara managed the head and neck. They worked like that through the small hours, spelling each other in short rests, and Eli fell asleep in the hallway chair around 2 in the morning with his boots still on and his hands folded in his lap. Around 3, Daniel stirred and muttered something about a horse he had apparently argued with at some point, and Ruth and Clara exchanged a look across the bed that was the beginning of something. Ruth almost smiled. It was the first time Clara had seen her come close to it, and she filed it away alongside the other things she was learning about this child. That she had her father's patience and her mother's attention to detail and a sense of humor she kept behind her teeth most of the time, waiting to see whether it was safe to use. At some point in the darkest part of the night, Ruth said quietly that her mother had known about plants and things. Clara said she was glad May had known that. Ruth said she kept a garden for it. A medicinal garden, she called it. She grew chamomile and yarrow and a few other things I can't remember the names of now. Nobody kept it up after she died. "I could help you bring it back," Clara said. "In the spring, if you wanted." Ruth did not say anything to that. She pressed the cloth to Daniel's ankle and replaced it when it warmed, and the lamp burned low between them, and the rain outside had slowed to a murmur against the window pane, and neither of them needed to say anything else for the idea to take hold. At 4 in the morning, Daniel's fever broke. Clara felt it first in his wrist, the pulse slowing from that tight, rapid beat into something more like water that had found the shape of its channel. She pressed her palm to his forehead and felt the heat retreat beneath her hand. Not gone entirely, but the crisis done. His breathing deepened and slowed into true sleep. The pinched look left his face. Color came back to his lips. She sat back in her chair and let her own breath out slowly. Eli appeared in the doorway. He had woken on his own, the way men woke when they had been listening to something without knowing it. He looked at his son for a long moment, and then at Clara, and then he sat down in the chair Ruth had left and put his face in his hands. Not weeping exactly. Something quieter than weeping and harder in its way. Clara said, "He'll need a few days of rest. Broth when he'll take it. 1 more cup of the bark tea in the morning, and then you can stop it. His color will come back by evening." Eli lifted his face. His eyes were red from the long night and from something else. He said, "How did you learn all of that?" "My father took me on his rounds from the time I was 8 years old. He said a doctor's child who didn't learn medicine was a waste of a perfectly good apprentice." Eli looked at his son sleeping with his mouth slightly open and his hair damp at the temples, and the relief on his face was the kind that came only after real fear had passed. He said, "Silas Horne told me this morning that I had made a reckless decision bringing you out here, that a woman traveling without papers was a risk to my household." Clara said, "He may still be right. You have known me 12 hours. I've known you through a night of fever," Eli said. The distinction was plain between them. He looked at her across the lamp. "What would you need to feel this was a fair arrangement? To stay, I mean, not just tonight." Clara thought about it. The room you offered, 3 meals, fair wages on Fridays, and to be left to do my work without having to prove myself over again every other day. Eli said, "Then you'll stay." He did not make it a question, and Clara was glad of that. She was tired of being asked questions. If you're still with us on this porch, do this story a kindness. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell. These quiet stories don't get told if you don't share them. Tag someone who loves a true frontier story in the comments. Let them know we're telling these the way they deserve to be told. Dr. Edgar Pratt arrived at the ranch the next morning in time for the second pot of coffee. He was a compact man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a close-cut gray beard, and he went to see Daniel first, coming back to the kitchen with his face rearranged into something that held both surprise and a kind of professional respect. "Fever's broken completely," he said. "Breathing's clear." He looked at Clara. "What did you give him?" She told him. He nodded steadily through the list, his head tilting slightly at the elderflower combination. "That's your father's treatment," he said. "Yes." "What was his name?" "Dr. Amos Marsh. He practiced in Lancaster, Ohio for 30 years. Pratt was quiet for a moment. "I know that name. He published a paper in 1861 on fever management in rural populations without hospital access. Good paper. Well argued." He looked at her with different attention. "You his daughter?" "His only child," Clara said. Pratt pulled out a chair and sat down without waiting to be asked. "Tell me what you observed through the night." She told him the whole of it, the pulse rate and the progression of the color and the way the bark and elderflower had worked through the hours. Pratt listened and asked precise questions, and she answered them without hesitation, and by the end of it he was nodding with his elbows on the table. "You've had proper training," he said. "My father was thorough." He looked at Eli, and then back at Clara. "I have more patients than I can properly reach in this territory. I've been looking for someone with real medical knowledge for 2 years." He paused. "If you're interested in a formal arrangement alongside your work here, I'd like to discuss it." Clara set her coffee cup down. "That's a generous offer." "It's a practical one," Pratt said. "I'm 61 years old, and my knees are going." The word traveled that afternoon the way word traveled in a town of Harrow Creek size, which was to say it went everywhere at once and arrived ahead of itself. Everyone who had seen Clara turned away in the rain the night before now knew that she had been the one to break the Calloway boys' 3-day fever, which the doctor himself had not quite managed. It went through the feed store and the millinery and the hotel and Mrs. Greer's boarding house. It came back to the steps of First Methodist, where Horne heard it from Mrs. Aldrich, who stood with her basket on her arm and did not look at him while she said it. Clara knew none of this until Ruth told her at supper, plainly and without ceremony, as a report of fact. Ruth said people in town were talking about Daniel's fever, that Mrs. Crawford had stopped by that afternoon to say she was glad the boy was better and had left a pie on the counter. Ruth pointed to the pie. She said she thought Mrs. Crawford felt bad about something. Clara served the potatoes and sat down. Daniel was at the table now, still pale but upright, and had taken half a bowl of broth that afternoon and was asking about biscuits. "People don't always do their best thinking in the rain," Clara said. Ruth looked at her across the table with an expression that took Clara a moment to read, and then she recognized it. Ruth was deciding whether to trust her, and the decision was going in one direction. "My mother would have liked you," Ruth said. It was the kind of thing a child said that meant everything. Clara received it as such. She reached for the bread basket and passed it across the table, and they ate supper together in the lamplight, and neither of them needed to say another word to understand what had just passed between them. 2 days after Daniel's fever broke, Elder Silas Horne came to the Calloway ranch. Clara was in the kitchen garden pulling the last of the autumn squash when she heard the buggy on the road. She straightened and watched him come and did not move toward the house or away from it. She stayed where she was with mud on her hands and a squash under her arm and let him climb down from the buggy and look at her across the garden fence. He was a man in his late 50s with a preacher's bearing, and she could see now in daylight what the rain the other night had obscured. He had come here at some cost to himself, and the cost was visible in how he held his shoulders. He said, "Mrs. Moss." "Elder Horne," she said. He said, "I owe you an apology." Clara set the squash on the fence post and waited. "I made a judgment about your character on very little evidence," he said, "and that judgment left you out in the cold on a dangerous night in a town you did not know. I've heard from Edgar Pratt about your father and your training. I've heard what you did for the Calloway boy." He paused and looked at a point somewhere past her shoulder. "I was wrong." Clara looked at him for a moment. He was waiting for her to accept quickly and let him go, which was what he wanted. She decided he could stand there a moment longer, because she had something to say, and she was going to say it without softening it. "My letters of reference were in a tin box," she said. "I had a letter from the reverend of my congregation in Lancaster, a letter from a neighbor whose children I nursed through 2 winters, and a letter from my late husband's mother, who was not a warm woman, but who was scrupulously honest. They went into the river near Bent's Fort. I came to the church because I believed a church was what a church was supposed to be. I was cold and I was alone, and I had told you the truth. Horne stood with that. I should have asked different questions, he said finally. You should have let me answer before you made your decision, Clara said. But I accept the apology. He nodded, and something in his posture shifted the way a man shifted when he set something down. Dr. Pratt tells me he has offered you an arrangement with his practice, he said. He has. I would not oppose it, Horne said, if that matters to you at all. Thank you, Clara said. She meant it, and she let him hear that she meant it. And then she picked up her squash and went back to the garden, and after a moment, she heard him climb back into his buggy and go. Clara stayed at the Calloway ranch. It was not a single decision. It settled into permanence by degrees, the way most real things did, one day adding itself to the next until the weight of all the days together was enough to hold. She kept to what she had agreed. Meals and housekeeping and nursing when it was needed, the room that was hers, wages on Fridays. She built her medicine chest from herbs she gathered in the hills above the ranch and plants she ordered from the apothecary in Denver. She placed her father's ledger of medical notes on the shelf above her writing table and her mother's Bible beside it. And the room became hers the way rooms became yours when you stopped sleeping in them like a guest. Ruth came to trust her by small degrees, each one deliberate. She asked Clara to show her how to read a fever by wrist and forehead together. She asked what different pulses meant and wrote the answers down in her own notebook in her careful, even hand. She began, without mentioning it, to follow Clara through the kitchen the way Clara had once followed her father. Clara taught her the same way she had been taught, without making a lesson of it, letting the knowledge pass from hand to hand in the course of the work that needed doing. Daniel simply decided he liked her and announced it at supper one Tuesday in October without any preamble. He said, "Miss Clara, you're staying forever, right?" and looked at her with the complete confidence of a 7-year-old who considered this a settled matter. Clara said she intended to stay as long as she was useful. Daniel considered this for a moment and said, "That's forever," then, and went back to his beans. Eli, who had been looking at his plate, did not look up for a moment. When he did, he was looking at Clara, and his expression was the one she was beginning to recognize. Not quite speaking, but close to it. She looked back. Then she asked Ruth if there was more bread, and the moment passed. In November, Mrs. Aldrich came to the door. She stood on the front porch with a basket on her arm, and an expression suggesting she had rehearsed what she intended to say and was not entirely certain she remembered it. She was 60 years old and had stood under the church eaves with Horne on the night Clara was turned away. Clara had not forgotten this, and she did not pretend to have forgotten it, because her father had always said that pretending to have forgotten something was not the same as forgiving it. She opened the door and said, "Mrs. Aldrich, come in." Mrs. Aldrich came in. She set her basket on the kitchen table. Inside were 2 jars of preserved plums and a paper-wrapped bundle of dried chamomile from her own garden. She said her daughter-in-law's baby had come 3 weeks early and would not nurse properly, and she had heard Clara had knowledge of such things, and she was asking for help. Clara said yes. She put on her coat. She spent the afternoon at the Aldrich house with the young mother and the infant, and by the time she left, the baby was nursing, the mother was tearful with relief, and Mrs. Aldrich was standing in the kitchen doorway, watching Clara pack her bag. She said, "I'm ashamed of that night, of standing there saying nothing while Silas talked." Clara said, "The baby's nursing now. That's what matters." "That's generous of you," Mrs. Aldrich said. "It's true," Clara said. "Come to the ranch next week, and I'll show you what to do if the trouble comes back." Mrs. Aldrich came the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and eventually she was coming for reasons that had nothing to do with the baby, and Clara did not remark on this because there was nothing to remark on. In December, Dr. Pratt made their arrangement formal. Clara would work 3 days a week in his practice, riding into town with Eli on his supply runs, or driving the wagon herself when the roads were clear. She was not a doctor, and she did not present herself as one. But Pratt introduced her to his patients by name and argued with her about treatment and listened when she argued back, and the territory they covered together was wider and better served than either of them could have managed alone. Winter came hard to Harrow Creek, the snow beginning in earnest before the end of November and closing the ranch from town for long stretches when the roads were impassable. Clara learned the rhythms of the Calloway house the way she had learned her father's practice, by watching and paying attention and letting the work teach her. She learned that Eli read at night by the stove when he could not sleep, and that he kept his accounts with painstaking care, and that he was a man who would work a fence in weather that kept other men indoors without making any noise about it. She learned that Ruth was afraid of nothing except the sound of ice cracking on the creek in the thaw. She learned that Daniel could be talked into almost any chore for the price of 3 dried apricots, and that he had a gift for making animals trust him that she had not seen in a child before. She learned that Eli watched her the way her father had watched the weather, with close attention and patience that seemed capable of lasting a long time. She learned that he trusted what he saw more than what he was told, and that what he saw, when he watched her, seemed to be a thing he had not expected to find, but was not going to look away from now that he had. On a Tuesday evening in late January, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet and the stove had been banked for the night, Eli came to the kitchen for water and found Clara at the table with her father's notes open in front of her and a lamp burning beside her. He poured his water and stood there. She said, without looking up, "You don't have to hover." He sat down across from her. She said, "What is it?" He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me if it's too soon or too strange." Clara closed the notebook. He said, "I'd like you to stay here, not as a housekeeper, as something more than that." He looked at his hands on the table, and then back at her. "Ruth already says your name in a way that isn't how you talk about an employee. Daniel thinks you hung the moon. I've been watching you work for 4 months and watching you with my children, and I've been trying to figure out when it would be right to say this, and I can't work that out, so I'm just saying it." Clara was quiet. He said, "I don't talk easily about these things." "I've noticed," she said. "Then you know what it cost me to say them." She looked at him across the lamp. The light was amber and steady between them, and she could see him clearly. A widower who had not asked for help and had been too proud to need it until the night he picked up a stranger's bag in the mud because his son was sick. A man who had defended her without knowing her and given her work and wages and a room that was hers, and had never once made her feel she owed him more than the work she was doing. She said, "I'm not ready to remarry. Not yet." He nodded. "But I'm not leaving," she said. "I need you to know that. I'm not leaving in the spring or because something better comes along. This is my home now." She paused. "If that's enough for now." Eli said, "That's enough for now." He stood, and he took his water glass, and he said good night, and the fact that he said it with something that was not quite a smile, but was close to one, was enough to carry Clara all the way up the stairs. Spring arrived in Colorado the way it always did in the high country, too slowly and then all at once. The snow went off the hills in great rushing streams, and the first green appeared along the creek before the mud had properly dried. Clara spent the first warm Saturday of March in the kitchen garden with Ruth, turning the beds that had lain fallow since May died. They worked through the morning, pulling old roots and winter debris, and Ruth talked about what her mother had grown there and where she had placed things and why, and Clara listened without trying to replace any of it. Ruth was not looking for replacement. She was looking for someone to remember with, and that was something Clara knew how to be. They planted the medicinal bed together, Ruth setting in the places May's plants had occupied, Clara adding the ones her father had taught her, and by noon they had something that belonged to both of them, which was about as much as anyone could hope for. Daniel came out with a bucket at noon and offered to water things, and they let him, even though he watered plants that were not yet in the ground, because the effort mattered more than the accuracy. Eli brought sandwiches to the garden at noon and sat on the stone wall while they ate, and Daniel explained to him at length which plants were which and what each one did, a recitation he had assembled from what Clara had told him that morning and already reorganized in his memory into something that was partly right and entirely confident. Eli listened with a straight face. He had a gift for that. It was ordinary, entirely ordinary. Clara sat on the stone wall in the March light, and felt the ordinariness of it settle over her the way warmth settled after cold. Not dramatic, just deeply, plainly good. She thought of the rain in her face outside the church door, and she thought of her father's voice saying that the only thing that got a person through a bad situation was refusing to look at all of it at once. She had only looked at the next step, just the next one, and here she was. In April, Dr. Pratt made their arrangement formal in writing. He composed a letter on his own stationery naming her as his nursing associate, signed it himself, and handed it to her across his desk and told her to put it somewhere dry this time. Clara put it in her mother's Bible between the pages of the Psalms, where she kept the things she wanted to keep. She wrote to Thomas's mother in Lancaster and said she had found work she was suited for in a household that needed her and that she thought Thomas would have been glad. Thomas's mother wrote back a long letter that was not warm, but was honest, and it was enough. Horne delivered a brief apology to his congregation in May, without naming Clara directly, in a way that anyone present would understand was about her. He said the church had a duty of discernment and also a duty of charity, and that the two were not always the same thing, and that he had erred on the wrong side of that line on the night in question, and that he was sorry for it. Mrs. Aldrich told Clara about it the following Thursday. Clara said she thought that was right and moved on to the question of the baby's colic. Summer came and went and came again. The medicinal garden grew, and Ruth learned to identify plants by the smell of their leaves before she looked at their shape, which was how her father's training had gone, and how Clara's had gone before her, and how it would go forward. Daniel grew 2 inches and lost 2 teeth, and started spending 2 afternoons a week at the blacksmith forge in town, an arrangement Eli had made with a handshake and a fair price. Clara went to church on Sundays and sat in the 3rd pew and nodded to Horne when she passed him on the way out, and he nodded back, and neither of them said anything unnecessary about it. On a Thursday evening in the 2nd summer, Eli asked her to marry him in the kitchen while she was wrapping a sprained wrist she had been treating since noon. He asked it while she was concentrating on a wrap, which she later suspected was deliberate because it meant she could not see his face clearly until she had finished. She finished. She looked at him. She said yes. They married in September, with Dr. Pratt as a witness and the congregation of First Methodist present, because Clara had asked Horne to hold the service, which was a form of grace that cost her something, and she gave it anyway. Ruth stood beside her and held the flower she had picked herself from the medicinal garden, late-blooming yarrow, and the last of the chamomile. Daniel stood beside his father and held the ring with both hands, and his face was composed, completely still, the way his father's face was composed when something mattered. The morning was clear and cold, and the light came through the church windows at an angle that turned the plain pine pews to something richer than they were, and Mrs. Aldrich was in the 4th row with her handkerchief out before the service was half done. She had come to Harrow Creek with a carpet bag and no references and the rain in her face, and the church had closed its door. A man had picked up her bag from the mud and driven her 4 miles into the dark on no more than her own word, and she had earned her place in his household one night and one day at a time until it was as fully hers as anyone's. The lamp in the kitchen window burned every night from that point forward, the light of it visible from the road, the kind of light that said the door behind it would open. She had not asked Eli to leave it burning. He had started doing it sometime in October of her first year and had never stopped, and she had noticed it and never said anything about it because some things were true enough without words. Her father's Bible sat on the shelf above the stove where she had placed it. The letter from Pratt was still between the Psalms. The garden came back each spring a little larger than the year before. Daniel grew tall and Ruth grew certain. The way girls grew certain when they had work they were good at and knew it, and the knowledge she carried was her mother's first, and then Clara's, and then her own. Clara Moss Calloway set the table each morning in the house that was hers, and made the bread her mother had taught her, and read fevers by wrist and forehead, and color the way her father had taught her. And the door of the Calloway ranch was never closed to anyone who came to it in the cold or the rain. She did not announce this as a principle or a policy. She simply lived it day after day in every season, and the people who came to that door in need found the lamp already burning before they could knock. Some came for medical help. Some came because they had heard there was a woman at the Calloway place who would listen and not judge. Some came for no reason they could have put into words, only a feeling that the light in that window was the kind that said, "Come in," and they were not wrong. In a country as large and lonely as Colorado, that kind of truth spread without any help at all, and in time it became what the ranch was known for, which was the only kind of reputation worth having. Thank you for staying until the last word. If this story moved you, the next one is already up on your screen. Go get a watch. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and join the porch. We're telling stories about women who carried more than the world ever knew. See you in the next one.